Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. When Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election, many Democrats and the candidate herself put the loss down to a conspiracy of events. Trump should never have won the election, they say. 4 years later, he has lost to Joe Biden, but by a whisker. In fact, Trump has won the second highest number of votes of any presidential candidate in US history. Despite 4 chaotic years and a raging pandemic, it seems huge numbers of Americans were willing to put their faith in the most controversial US president in a century. Today, we've got 2 guests to look at Trump's support and examine what it says about US politics in the long term. They are Doug Preisse, a Republican Party strategist from Ohio, closely associated with the former Ohio Governor, John Kasich. Hello, Doug, how are you?
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Great to have you with us. And we've also got Professor Thomas Baldino, Emeritus Professor of Politics at Wilkes University in Pennsylvania. Viewers of our US Political Tour series will be familiar with Tom. Hello, Tom. I think you're there, Tom. I think you can hear us. Yeah, I think you can. You just got to unplug your microphone.
Correct. Yeah, sorry. Yes, hello.
There he is.
Good to have you with us, Tom. There is a bit of feedback or something, which is a problem with my computer, so apologies in advance for that, but we'll muddle through that. Doug, I'm going to start with you. You're in Ohio, which is a very good place to start. Can you tell us how well Trump did there, and did you expect it?
Well, he did very well indeed. We had, as you can expect, any number of office polls and bets and then official polling out there by political groups and newspapers, et cetera, which showed a lot of things. But I did actually predict that he was going to win Ohio. He did win Ohio just as strong and maybe a little better than he did 4 years ago. And I think there's some underlying reasons for that. I'm actually calling in from rural Ohio, southeast Ohio, or the area we call Appalachia. And this is one of the areas where you could say that's why Trump did well 4 years ago and even better this year. I've never seen the kind of enthusiasm, not for Ronald Reagan, not for any of the Clintons or Barack Obama, out in the hinterland. Just across the street from here, my neighbor's flying a gigantic Trump flag. And this gentleman down the country lane, he lives in a trailer, what we call a double wide, a very modest home and a very modest small businessman. And never seen the intensity like that. I'm interested to ask the professor if it was the same way between the cities in Pennsylvania. Trump did well here. Some of us predicted it. I did win that office bet. But that's because in great part, I got out of the cities. I spent some time in the countryside and I watched it happening, even though some of the polling did not pick up people's personal sentiments.
And the polling, do you think in Ohio was broadly accurate? Because elsewhere, they clearly did underestimate his support.
Much of the polling showed it a little closer than the 8 points. I do firmly believe, and this is my gut, I've got a lot of professional pollsters who are friends, but I think the trend in recent years has been particularly among conservatives and particularly among a little more skeptical small town voters. They don't want to say what they're going to, they don't want to say what they're going to do. And frankly, and I know a lot of Republicans who held their nose and voted for Donald Trump. If there was somebody, if there was a candidate an Ohio voter was going to vote for earlier this month, but didn't want to admit it publicly for a lot of reasons, that was Donald Trump.
Mm. Well, clearly the Republican vote is changing, and we're going to kind of come to an explanation or try and look at that in some depth in a moment with Tom. But just before we do that, Tom, can we talk about where you are? That's Pennsylvania. How accurate were the polls there, and how did Trump do? And how did he retain the support he had last time? Can you just tell us how he did?
Well, he did win Pennsylvania by a much narrower margin than the polls.
Biden won Pennsylvania, sorry.
Yes,
Biden.
I'm sorry. Yes, Biden won Pennsylvania. The margin was narrower than what the polls were predicting, even beyond the margin of error difference. And I actually thought Biden would win Pennsylvania. I expected the margin to be perhaps more than it was. I mean, it was barely 1%. I thought it would be 2, maybe 3%. I predicted that he would win in Luzerne County again, which is where I am. Luzerne County is one of those 3 counties in Pennsylvania that flipped from Biden to Trump in 2016. And of those 3 counties, 2 reverted back to the Democrat this year. Those other 2 were Erie County in the northwestern corner and Northampton County, which is just south and east of us. But Luzerne County has retained its support for Trump. What did happen is the difference between Trump's margin in 2016 and this year was a bit smaller. So Biden's candidacy did help the Democrat, and this the Democratic Party anyway, close the gap, right? Biden is a much more likable candidate here than Hillary Clinton ever was, even though Clinton had some family ties to the area in the Lackawanna County, which is where Scranton is, which is just north of us. So there is this dichotomy in Pennsylvania between the 2 urban cores, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and pretty much the rest of the state, which is rural. There's a famous quote from James Carville back in 1994, when he was the advisor to then gubernatorial candidate in the state, Bob Casey Sr. He said there was Philadelphia, actually the exact quote was Paoli and Penn Hills, which are Philadelphia and Pittsburgh suburbs, and Alabama in between without the blacks. And that's been shortened and paraphrased to Philadelphia, Pittsburgh with Alabama in between, right? And that's where Pennsylvania is right now. When you look at it overall, it's more purplish than red or blue, but that's a function of the concentrations of the 2 respective parties.
Okay. So, I mean, clearly we all know that Trump surprised the pollsters. We're not going to talk as though Trump won, Biden clearly won, but we are here to look at broadly what is happening to the Republican vote. And before we get into that in more detail, Doug, I want to come back to you. You are what I would view as a centrist Republican. Your former boss backed Joe Biden, as I believe you did. What are your reasons for doing that as a Republican?
Right. 4 years ago, the convention was in my home state here in Cleveland, Ohio, and I was a delegate, as I've been to many Republican conventions. Not surprising, perhaps, I was not invited back to be a delegate this year. And we were talking before the program began. For the first time since 1980, when I cast my first vote for president with Ronald Reagan, this is the first time I've ever voted other than for the Republican nominee for the Democrat. And 4 years ago, we said, well, and I voted for John Kasich 4 years ago, even in the general, but we said, okay, well, now it's Donald Trump's chance to prove that he can rise to the occasion, do what other statesmen and stateswomen have famously done, emerge, grow, mature, rise to the crisis and the occasion. And most recently, the crisis he has utterly failed to appropriately address was the COVID, continues to be the COVID crisis here and arguably around the world with America's responsibilities. But even before that, Teddy Roosevelt famously said, carry a big stick and speak softly. He spoke from what was known as the bully pulpit, whereas we think Donald Trump has merely been a bully, both domestically and internationally. So he never proved that he was a unifier, that he brought the country together in ways that presidents from both parties have done in the past. And so a lot of us in the middle felt he did not earn our vote. And we are a smaller group than I wish I could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's fascinating. And I think Mitt Romney would be in a similar boat to you, although he didn't go as far as voting for Biden or backing Biden. But it seems to be there's less and less room for that sense of compromise, that sort of bipartisan approach within the party. That's at least our impression. Tom, let's come back to you. I associate this division in this sort of winner-takes-all approach in the Republican Party back in the 1990s. I think of Newt Gingrich, But I think you're going to take this analysis a step or two further than that, and also go back to what the founding fathers thought of when they were putting this constitutional framework together. We spoke about this earlier. Can we just go over some of the comments that you and I are talking about before we started this?
Sure. So what I would like to do is just to explain why I feel so concerned about the future of not just America's political system, but our underlying political cultural value system, right? So when the people who wrote our Constitution back in 1787 did so, the constitutional structure was based on what were then shared values. Not the United States was a country predominantly white, predominantly Christian, and I would argue, and it wouldn't be original with me, that the two core principal values were individual rights and freedoms, the idea of individualism, freedom's paramount, and the other value, which is in tension with that, would be the democracy value, or the idea of community responsibility. And so as a political scientist, when I was teaching American government regularly, we talked about America as a liberal democracy. Right? Those two things are in tension. Do you emphasize the individual rights, or do you emphasize the community responsibilities? And in the course of American history, the direction or focus of the country would shift slightly to the right or left, or emphasizing individual rights or emphasizing community responsibility. And as long as the general population understood and agreed with those two principles, whether or not one would want to emphasize more the individual rights or the community responsibilities is another, that's part of the game. That's our system held together, right? But what's become very apparent to me is that, yes, we have a written constitution, a constitution of laws. That system absolutely needs the norms and values on which the Constitution is based to also be respected and shared. And what we've seen is those common values have become eroded and certainly frayed, if not eroded. And what the framers could not have envisioned, right? No one back in the 1787 could have envisioned it. Mass communication, social media, and the erosion, and I don't want to keep using the word erosion, but the weakening of truth and facts, right? We don't have a common set of facts anymore. And those facts are important to have values. And if you don't share facts, you can't share values, or vice versa. And so what we've seen is and again, I don't blame Trump so much for this. He didn't cause it. He is just the manifestation of the worst aspects of what's been happening. He comes along and he exploits the weakness of our values. And then he, in the process of exploiting those weaknesses to get elected, basing campaigns, and the current one to challenge the legitimacy of the election, just throwing out lies and falsehoods that his supporters are willing to accept.
Tom, if I can just I'm just trying to apply this to periods of recent political history. So I talked about Newt Gingrich. I know that you wanted to trace it back a bit before that. And then after that, I'm also thinking about the rise of the Tea Party. I mean, there's a progression, if you think, really going back, I think you're going to say, to the 1970s, that show the Republican Party moving in this way, becoming more anti-establishment, anti-Washington, more populist.
Yeah, so yes, in our earlier conversation. So I would lay some of this, a good bit of it on at the feet of Richard Nixon, because of his 1968 campaign and thereafter, in which he went after the Southern Democratic base, right? One of the core constituencies of the New Deal coalition that FDR created was the South and the old Confederate South, right? Nixon went after that by basically saying, in a sense, the Republican Party, the former party of Lincoln, would be willing to um, give up concern for the rights of African Americans in order to advance the party in the South by co-opting former Democrats using the slogan law and order, right? The campaign theme of law and order. That picks up in 72. It fades in 76, but Ronald Reagan brings it in to a lesser extent, but also emphasizes the importance of individualism, right? And so where the country had been from FDR through Kennedy and certainly LBJ, Johnson, drifting more towards community obligations and responsibilities, Nixon begins to move that country back towards the other side. Reagan accelerates that. And then along comes Newt Gingrich. And this is where you and I would agree. Newt Gingrich, as a member of Congress, undermined I shouldn't say undermined, but certainly did a lot to take what had been an effort to achieve bipartisanship in Congress, whatever that kind of meant at that time, and basically began that polarization process.
Okay. Hold that thought. Doug, I want you to also hold that thought for a second, but can you just talk about Trump's effectiveness as a populist? Is he going to stick around? Do you think he's lost the election? Does that mean he's going away? And then can you come back and address what Tom's been talking about, which is this gradual erosion of faith in the political system, using this polarization to undermine the structures that the US relies upon?
I think he certainly is a populist, as I would define it. And my former boss, Governor Kasich, we've talked about positive populists and negative populists, those that bring people together, broad groups of voters or of the populace together with positive themes and initiatives, and those that might bring people together by vilifying particular sections of the society. I think clearly Donald Trump is a negative populist, but he's an effective populist nonetheless. Two great examples, I think, right here in Ohio. By the way, I don't know if you can see it on your shot of my bookshelf. I almost moved a little bust of Napoleon that's over my right shoulder because it looked like it was growing out of my head. And then earlier today, I thought, no, I'm going to leave it there because he was a populist. He was a strong man. Somewhere, and the professor and others can speak better than I to these issues, that in times of crisis, it seems to be human nature through history, and even today, not only in America, we see it in Europe and elsewhere, to turn to the strong man, to the leader to keep us safe. And one could say going into 16 and in 20, we weren't facing crises, but there are certain populations of the country and in Ohio, Appalachia, and the professor talked about that sway between the cities, that I think you clearly have predominantly white, small town, rural, Appalachian, less educated, and after the demise of the coal industry and some of the smaller industries, the steel industry, where I'm from, Northeast Ohio, the rubber industry, these things went away in the last 30, 40 years, 50 years. Those people have been living a crisis for decades. And along came a strong man. I think the best example in Ohio, we have a county called Mahoning County. Some of your participants might be familiar with the old industrial town of Youngstown that 40, 50 years ago was the steel capital of this country and arguably the world. No steel is made in Youngstown today. We talked about Mitt Romney earlier. This is a predominantly historically Democrat county. Mitt Romney only got 35% in that very large county in Ohio. Trump 4 years ago got 46%. And the professor talked about counties flipping back and forth in this state. This large county, old industrial county, this year went 50.3% for Trump. Why is that? Well, he's been a negative populist, but as I say, an effective populist, speaking to the disaffected sections of the population. And I blame Democrats for losing them, and I blame traditional Republicans for not paying close enough attention in recent years to appeal to those folks on more positive lines. Your second point, Nick, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, just as an example of that, we were talking about Trump's success as a populist. And I just wanted to emphasize what you were telling me earlier, that he's not going to go away. You talked about the veiled threat to Mike DeWine who's the current governor of Ohio. Maybe talk a bit about that.
Right. We've had an ongoing debate in my office with my colleagues who have similar center-right Republicans and even rather more conservative than I, and nonetheless frustrated and ultimately disappointed with Trump. And they were hoping that once he's politically dead and buried, he'd go away. And I cautioned even some months ago, why would we think he's going to go away the way traditional ex-presidents do and behave, usually not getting involved in day-to-day politics? He never behaved in a traditional way while he's been in office for 4 years. I think he's going to continue to be a problem for those of us trying to move forward, bring the center together, refashion the Republican Party, because why should we expect him to step out of character and do anything else going forward? I think that's going to be a problem for us.
I guess Tom's point is that Trump is a symptom of he's a continuation. If you look at I bang on about Newt Gingrich, and then there's the Tea Party, and then you have Trump. You know, it is basically a sort of populist takeover, if you like, of the Republican Party. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And I agree. The challenge for those of us who hope to be part of the reconstruction, the re-envisioning of the party, from the Republican Party standpoint, other than losing the presidency, which of course is 75% of it or more, it's the big banana, but down ticket. We did very well in Ohio. We increased our seats in the state legislature. We held all of our congressional seats, and that played out across, there was no blue wave, that played out across the country. So actually achieving a new vision and getting to the hearts of the partisans is going to be doubly difficult. And indeed, some of us who criticize President Trump were the last people, a lot of the quote unquote, I would say I'm a more loyal Republican long term than some of the folks that said, I don't care what he does or says, I'm for him. That, to me, that's a blind loyalty. That's not true loyalty.
Okay. Now, we've got a great group of people following us on this conversation today, many of whom have been to Ohio. Some of them have met you, Doug. Many of them have been listening in to Tom Baldino during our political series. So please do start putting your questions into the Q&A box here to Tom and Doug as we continue this conversation. I'm interested in a whole series of things. I want to know about the blue collar vote. It seems to me that it's a dwindling population. Why is it so important? Will it continue to be so important? I want to know about and that's a problem for the Democratic Party. It used to be, as you say, those areas like Youngstown, Lordstown, up in the northeast of Ohio. You know, those are presumably areas that the Democratic Party have got to win back in the meantime. And if not, do they have a strategy, an alternative strategy? And then there are the splits within both parties. We've been focusing on the Republican Party in terms of the split between the traditionalists, as I perhaps would characterize you, Doug, and the sort of the post-Tea Party populists on the one side. But then turning to you, Tom, the Democrats have got a problem, haven't they? I mean, not just chasing the blue collar vote, but there's also the tension with the left within their own party. So looking ahead, the next couple of years are going to be very, very difficult for them, Tom.
Yes, and the Democrats, as you say, have their own problems. Biden represents the middle, mainstream, if you will, Democrats. And then there is that wing, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and that group, the progressives, who would see the party. And by the way, I think those progressives more as Democratic populists, right? They are to the Democrats what the Freedom Caucus or the Tea Partiers would be to the Republican Party. There's an uneasy alliance right now in the Democratic Party between the moderates led by Biden and the other group. But that meeting that Nancy Pelosi held with House Democrats a week or so ago demonstrated, based on what came out, you know, the dribs and drabs that came out of it, that there is tension within the Democratic caucus in the House, a much smaller caucus. And it will be interesting to see how well Nancy Pelosi can lead that group with such a small majority. And in any case, that's going to be a problem for Biden too. I mean, he needs to lean on Pelosi We have yet to see, we don't know yet what exactly the situation will be in the Senate, but it doesn't look good for the Democrats to win both of those seats.
Yeah.
Things can happen, but right now it doesn't look good.
Okay, let's bring in some questions now. We've got Hilary Matthews. If we can bring Hilary Matthews up. While Hilary is just being brought online, Doug, can you just tell us a bit more about that area in the northeast of Ohio? You're just talking about Youngstown, Lordstown, because I think this is, well, Hilary, we've got you there now. So since Hilary is there, Hilary, go ahead with your question, Hilary.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. Well, I just had two quick questions. One is, did the Trump administration manage to create any jobs in the areas that were steel producers? Because that's what he won on. He kept saying he would create jobs in those depressed steel producing areas. And the second one, perhaps a bit more relevant towards the end of the discussion, is if you were Biden, what would you do to try and close this really polarized gap and appease or help or support the Trump voters, who after all was 73 million people?
Yeah, two great questions, Hilary. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Doug.
Right, and thanks, Hilary. Nice to chat with you. Yes, he did talk about creating jobs, and he did talk about bringing steel jobs back to Youngstown. That has not happened. 4 years ago, I said I'd be the first one to go up and stand by as Donald Trump cut the ribbon on the new steel plant that he promised, and then we would support him. That didn't happen. To quote you, Hilary, that's what he won on, quote unquote. It's certainly what he said, but I would argue that's not what he really won on. That was part of it. That was intertwined in his message. But his message was more to the core of these folks' feeling. I'll be interested in the professor's feelings about this too. I'm going to stick up for you. You've been, I was going to say a bad four-letter word. You've been pooped upon, I'll say, for too many decades. The Democrats have promised and promised again and again, and his rhetoric carried the day. And it did 4 years later. Sadly, I thought Youngstown and that area would revert, and I understand that Trump was full of hot air and not action. But it worked again. And I don't know that it'll work the next time for the next populist.
Okay, we've got more questions. Sheila Dibalague has got a question, so let's bring in Sheila. Go ahead, Sheila.
Hello, my question is, who are the leading centrist Republicans? And is there anyone who would have the slightest chance of taking over the leadership of the party from Donald Trump?
Doug, this comes back to you. This is a really interesting question because the Republican Party did an amazing job of registering new voters and in increasing the turnout in places. It was only that Biden managed to do a similar job or just a slightly better job. So they did an incredible job to do that. But isn't there an argument there about who owns those lists? So that really comes down to who is going to control the party afterwards. And that plays into Sheila's question about who are the next possible candidates. Doug.
Right. And although the lists, quote unquote, technically were developed and maybe temporarily held by the National Republican Party, every voter list is public in the United States. We can see not who you voted for, but if you voted and in what party you voted. It's really not a question of who owns the lists, but who can try to own the hearts and minds of the electorate going forward. In the case of this question, Republicans going forward. It's a very difficult knot to untie. Number one, Trump remains very, very popular with the Republican Party broadly, sadly to my estimation, but broadly. Many Republican leaders, many friends of mine have been cowed and cowered into standing up to him because there's a great fear that he'll get involved. And Nick, you mentioned only a few days ago when our current governor of Ohio, who's been around for many years, served many years admirably in the United States Senate. He's a strong leader of Ohio right now, and a conservative who won Ohio. He's up in 2 years, and as soon as he acknowledged a few days ago Biden's, the legitimacy of his election, Trump immediately texted, well, there's going to be an election in 2 years in Ohio. We'll see how Governor DeWine does, a not so thinly veiled threat. So sadly,
you envisaged that Trump could come in and actually weigh in on that campaign against him and have an effect.
I'm certain that Donald Trump is the most popular and powerful Republican in Ohio today, probably will be in 6 months, 12 months, and who knows, going into the the midterm elections in 2022. A lot of folks are afraid to tangle with him, have been. So we haven't seen a whole lot of Republicans stand up to him. Most of them are former folks like John Kasich. There are a few others. Mitt Romney is now in the Senate. He is one as well. You know, he's run before. He's unlikely to return as the standard bearer for the party.
Right. So there's nobody else at the moment who can fill those feet. I mean, I think Sheila will come if you want to come back in a bit and put another question. Do, but let's move on to some more questions. Geraldine Gill, Jerry, you go ahead. Jerry, I think Jerry, you're speaking to us from Texas, aren't you, Jerry? Just need you to get your. Okay. There you go. Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, has any thought been given to the next route for taking care of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed in our Constitution by the Trump presidency? It's like bad boys. You know, what can we do and how can we get around this?
Okay, that's a really good question. Let's put that to Tom. Well, let's rephrase that question to start with. Yeah. What are the vulnerabilities, do you think, Tom, that have been exposed by Trump's presidency?
Well, just off the top of my head, the ability of Trump to ignore requests for information from Congress, right? Just saying, I'm not sending my people, I'm not going to provide the information that you are requesting from your committees. That the whole issue with the Emoluments Clause, however you want to think of what Trump and his family did while in office to make money, it may be a stretch of the interpretation, but there are those who would love to see something done to more clearly delineate what the president can and can't do while in office that might enrich him or her. What else? The pardon power, right? Let's think about just what Trump is likely to do in the next 50 or so days to pardon perhaps himself, right? We don't know. And when we know what he's done, we'll see what he's going to do. There are those who would like to see the pardon power revisited. Unfortunately, some of these things will require a constitutional amendment, and that isn't going to happen with the current configuration of Congress.
I guess one of the big questions is about the Supreme Court and the way in which justices have been appointed. And the Republicans have shown that they are resolute and ruthless in terms of getting their candidates through. But I guess there's nothing unconstitutional about the way they've done it.
Not at all. No, that's, there are consequences that happen when presidents win, as Obama told John McCain, right? And everyone understands that. But the elimination of the Senate's rule that allows for filibustering appointments, when that went by the wayside, that opened up completely the opportunities for not just Republicans, but Democrat in the future to make these appointments. The next thing that might go, and it won't happen if the Republicans maintain control, is the elimination of the filibuster for any legislation in front of the Senate. That would allow, if the Democrats were to regain control of the Senate, would allow them to circumvent some of the obstruction that Mitch McConnell and the minority might engage in.
I will come back to you, Jerry, and also to you, Sheila, just to have another for some follow-up questions. But let's carry on with some other questions in the meantime. Simon Jackson, followed by Nigel Harley. Simon Jackson, go ahead.
Hello. To the extent that Trump may have aspirations to run again in 4 years' time, to what extent will his shenanigans over the last 3 weeks have damaged his standings with the broader Republican Party as opposed to the diehards?
Doug, this is the astounding thing. 73 million people. I mean, I think the problem with us is that we looked at Trump through our own, our own glasses and believe who could support him. And this huge number of people have come out and supported him, far bigger than any other presidential candidate beforehand. He continues to be popular. It's incredible to people like me. So what as Simon asks, in 4 years' time, how could he do?
I would argue, and I would argue strongly, that he has done nothing since the election that would alienate many Republicans, because he's so got a handle on their heartstrings. Now, I hope they forget, as this new administration, in contest, but where we can find it in cooperation with Congress, because you've got two old bulls of the United States Senate in Mitch McConnell and the president-elect in Biden. They have cut deals before. They know how to do it. And I've got a higher level of confidence that can happen. What is most likely to stop Donald Trump from running again is his personal affairs and what he's done in the previous 4 years as president, and before that, as a businessman, not only at the federal level, and he may or may not be able to pardon himself or engage in some shenanigans where he steps down and then Pence becomes president and can pardon him, but at the state level. Remember, there are various accusations and lawsuits and challenges to Trump at the state level, particularly in New York, controlled by Democrats at the city and state level. And I think it's more likely that he may run into trouble stemming from his personal life and business, and perhaps some things that took place behind the scenes in his presidency, but not the last 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you for that, Doug. Great question, Simon. Nigel Harley, next question. Go ahead, Nigel. Nigel, just need to open up your microphone on the bottom left-hand side. Are you there, Nigel? Okay, I'm going to ask Nigel's question for him. He seems to be having a problem getting his microphone open. Apart from the presidential race, the election was not a success for the Democrats. Are people frightened by a perceived shift to the left in the party, as seen with Ocasio-Cortez and her friends? Do they represent a significant number of voters? Tom, do you want to, we were speaking briefly about this. Is this a problem for the Democrats?
Well, yes, although the Democrats can't agree on just whose fault it was that down ballot Democrats didn't do as well. I mean, it's very clear that Biden's coattails, that expression, were non-existent, and that, as I think I said earlier, there is no, in my mind, Biden coalition, that people who voted for Biden among former Republicans were willing to just vote for Biden because he wasn't Trump. And then in down ballot races, whether it was for the Senate or the House, continued to vote Republican. And so the challenge for the Democrats and for Biden in particular is how to demonstrate, one, that he is not a socialist and that his policies as president will be more moderate, and that when he says, I will be the president for all the people, that he delivers on that. And I was reading something that there's a kind of an argument going on as to who his Secretary of Agriculture might be. And one of those people is a congresswoman who I think is from Ohio, an African-American woman. And she chairs a subcommittee on the Agriculture Committee. And she would take the position that the Department of Agriculture is about nutrition and food issues that go beyond farmers. It's about making sure that Americans of all income levels have food. And then there are those in the party who want Biden to appoint someone like Tom Vilsack, who was Secretary of Agriculture and who represented rural interests and farmers. And how he picks there, who he picks there, I should say, could indicate just what kind of outreach he'll make to more either rural Americans or blue collar Americans or whatever. So that'll be an interesting thing to look for.
Nigel, I think we've got you there. There seemed to be a problem with your microphone earlier. Yeah.
Yes. No, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, no, I think the question has been quite well answered. Thank you.
Okay. the question, I'm going to come to Martey Rhine in just a second, but in the run up to the election, we spent a lot of time talking to pollsters, and pollsters like to cut things up into neat categories. And in our approach during our political tour, the 7 broadcasts we did in the run up to election day, we looked at specific counties because of their, who the particulars of demographic or kind of voter there was in that particular county. So we looked at more rural counties, we looked at sort of ex-urban areas, suburban areas, and then urban areas. And the consensus seemed to be that this election was going to be about the battle for the suburbs. Did that hold out? It seems to me that Trump has done very, very well by getting the numbers of white blue-collar workers out and appealing to the sort of conservative base. It seemed to me that the expansion of the suburbs, which tends to promote a more liberal thinking and therefore more democratic thinking, didn't take place. Is that fair to say? Doug, to start with you perhaps, and then I'll come to you.
Well, I can speak with some knowledge, specific knowledge, about Ohio cities and suburbs. Ohio is the 7th largest state in the country. We've got 8 major metropolitan areas, and we've got a heck of a lot of suburbs. In my city, where I was chairman for 16 years until a few months ago, which is the capital city and the biggest city in Ohio, Trump lost significant support in the predominantly white, upper class and wealthy suburbs, many of them traditionally Republican. And he had a reverse coattail effect. We were wiped out 4 years ago, and it was worse a few weeks ago. And he did worse, but he didn't do much worse. And some of the Republicans who hold their nose and won't tell you that they voted for Donald Trump are those upper middle class, better educated, upper income kinds of Republicans. But he did poorly among them 4 years ago, a little bit worse, but not a lot worse this time. But he more than made up for it in the rural areas. And in some of those older suburbs, and then I'll be quiet, in some of those older suburbs, such as we mentioned and you mentioned in Northeast Ohio, the older industrial suburbs, there he did do better among the folks that have suffered economically.
There's been a lot of focus on this, and it seems that Trump's done very well with that particular group, but it would seem to be it's an area that has a diminishing return, Tom. These are not the populations of the future, are they?
No, not at all. And that's the case in Pennsylvania, where Trump had picked up a lot of ground. For example, in Luzerne County, our population is literally shrinking, right? We are losing population. People die or don't, and then when the young people move out. But as an example, comparable to what Doug was saying, in the ring suburbs around Philadelphia, the one suburb that Trump did slightly better than he did in 2016 was Bucks County, which is once where there were lots of steel mills, and those steel jobs have gone. And yet the strength of the Republican Party there, which once was very strong, it's still there, but just not to the extent that it was 4 or even 8 years ago, right? And the same thing you could say is what happened out in Pittsburgh. There's still some steel out in Pittsburgh, but nowhere near as many steel mills. And in these suburban areas, same thing. There's been an erosion of support for Trump among the wealthier, but not among the blue collar. And I think one of the things we've missed in saying is union membership in this country is now barely in double digits. The last time I looked, it was 10% of the population, the working population, is unionized. And that used to be part of the base of the Democratic coalition. There aren't that many union members anymore.
I think there's been so much focus and attention on this group because it's a group that feels left out, it feels marginalized. This feeds into our next question, which is from Martey Rhine. We've got a United States that is split and divided, with people feeling angry and left out. Martey, what's your question?
Well, first of all, I'm in Connecticut, and it seems to me that the most predominant factor of Trump's whole 4 years was based on lies and what he called fake news. And so my question is to what both of you think is going to be a process where we can reestablish what the truth really is.
Doug, do you want to take that? Or should we start with Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts?
I wish I knew, and so much has been written and will continue to be written about where we are today. Is it the 24-hour news cycle? Is it social media, the anonymity of social media, and the fact that we have become so siloed in what we consume. And if an honest liberal sits in front of Fox News all day, he or she's going to start at least questioning some of his or her opinions. And the same thing, if a conservative ignores Fox News and sits in a liberal outlet all day, at least they're going to start questioning some of their own concerns. But there's so many folks who don't consume anything but the news they already agree with or think they're going to agree with. And then these outlets become, I agree, irresponsibly narrow-minded and bend the truth. I see it in some of my favorite moderate to liberal news. I try to listen to all sides, but I see it on both sides. I wish I had an answer. I wish I had a solution. I don't have one. We got to keep trying, and to the extent we can, as an electorate, reward honesty and truth, and call out. That's part of the problem right now. People are afraid to call Republicans are afraid to call Trump when he's lying because they're afraid of the blowback. I hope Tom has a more hopeful prognosis.
I don't. When we can't agree.
Just before you do that, I think Hilary Williams has got a question that feeds directly into this. It's an interesting idea. Hilary, go ahead, and then Tom can respond to that because it feeds into this. Go ahead, Hilary, if she can. Is she there? I'm not too sure she is there. No, Hilary's question is, because I can't see her up here. Her question is there a case for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Can you see some kind of body that would try and construct a more sort of bipartisan cooperation, or whether it's on how the media deals with stories? Is there any argument for these kind of vehicles?
I can't imagine one being formed now. I can think that I could envision Biden trying to get one, but that would assume that the two sides could agree that there's a need for one, okay? And what I was going to say earlier is, when we can't agree with the things we're being told by medical experts that masks work to prevent the spread of the disease, and that becomes something about which we politically, I should say, we disagree, and it's political, but it's also social, and it has health implications. How more difficult is it going to agree to decide whether we're going to spend more money for infrastructure? I was thinking about this earlier.
It comes to this ideological battle between the freedom of the individual and the responsibility to society. And
but it's even more fundamental than that. It's a question of, are there experts who can tell us something that we can trust and believe in? And no, it doesn't. It just seems to be gone. And that's very, very frustrating for, I'm sure, the people who are trying to develop the policy that it's based on information that most people would consider factual, accurate.
We've got lots more questions coming through here. Philip Godfrey.
Hi, Nicholas. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, it's for me, it's quite interesting that the discussion, as ever, is all about Trump, but maybe, to be a bit perverse, he's done the Democrats and the progressive Republicans a favor, because he's actually exposed the 73 million. I mean, put Trump to one side. Does this not make the liberal America sit up and actually pay attention to the sort of forces that have led to 73 million votes? It strikes me that that's hard to ignore. And I'd just be interested in what the panelists feel about that. As I said, put Trump to one side, because we talk too much about him. What is happening in America that makes 73 million people comfortable, holding their noses maybe, but comfortable with voting for Trump.
I think that's the whole. I think it's the whole purpose of this discussion.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's called 73 million.
That's what we're trying to get to the bottom of.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So what do we
we don't
feel?
have any clear answers. I mean, Tom, you gave a good sort of description of sort of political trajectory of why this sort of anti-establishment vein in the Republican Party was doing so well. But Doug, what are your, I mean, just to respond to what Philip was saying, what are your explanations, putting Trump aside?
Right, and thanks, Philip. But I fear we might be able, in an academic sense, or to put Trump aside, but we can't put Trumpism aside. Back to what was commented upon earlier, and I agree. Trump is a symptom, not a cause. He's exacerbated it. He's provoked, and he's made public and more nasty some of the symptoms. But he's a symptom. The causes, if I may reflect upon what I said earlier, the causes are he tapped into a vein of feeling out there across a number of socioeconomic sectors, but clearly small town, rural, former industrial areas, folks that, right or wrong, have felt left out, have felt unheard. Big parts of the population, traditional Democrats. Others, frankly, in areas such as where I'm calling from, in rural Appalachian, Ohio, areas where they've felt disaffected for so long and wouldn't have a voice, that they tuned out and turned off. There's been an uptick in registration and electoral participation. So much as we'd like to put Trump aside for discussion purposes, that would not achieve, if he were to resign, vacation forever in the Bahamas, and we'd never hear from him again, put himself aside. The symptoms, he as a symptom went away, but the causes are still there. And I think the Democrats better pay attention to that too. As you keep pointing out, he got more votes than any other presidential candidate in history, except the one who just won. It's a hell of a lot. It's half the population. It's a heck of a lot of folks.
Doug, can I ask you a question? It's Philip again.
Yeah.
Does Biden's choice of his initial choice of his team, his transition team, suggest that he's learned the lessons of the 73 million? There's a journalist in the UK called Justin Webb who wrote a very persuasive article in the Times the other day that said that rather like Johnson when he took over from Kennedy, said, it's full of Harvardians. That may not be the expression, but it's full of guys from Harvard. Justin Webb said it's the same. It's the elite, it's the Brahmins that Biden is choosing. Would you agree with that or challenge that? But if you did agree with that, is that the right way to go?
My sense, and I come at it from the center right, in terms of trying to build a coalition, my sense is he's done well so far. Now, he picked for the first time, and there's some history we haven't talked about here, an African-American, a woman of mixed race ancestry, to be, as we like to arrogantly say here, but I'll say it proudly anyway, the assistant leader of the free world is now a woman of color. I think that goes a long way to hold his coalition together. He's going to have a broad cabinet to continue that. But if he goes too far, there are folks that will not. It's too easy to vilify "quote unquote" socialism. There are a lot of folks in rural America, small town America, that will not go for "quote unquote" socialism, an attack on religion. They admired Trump's supposed defense of religion, pro-life position. So I'm one that argues Biden better try to lead from the middle, or the coalition that he did just win with, tenuous and fragile as it may be, it was a winning coalition.
Yeah. Okay. That article, Justin Webb, was my thought on the Justin Webb article was that maybe the elitist universities of Harvard and Yale are accepting more. Those institutions can change too. I mean, do you have to recruit somebody who's come from a third-rate university to be your vice president, or can somebody of color come through those institutions as they seem to have done? That was my take on Webb's article. We've got Diane Cook with a question, then Claudia Baker. So go ahead, Diane.
Hi. Just as you were talking, not into the last question, but the one before that, my question really is that when we're talking about Trump and you know, his command of the media and actually the way that people follow that, it seems to me he's not been a very effective strong man when you compare him with people like Putin and Nazarbayev when he was in Kazakhstan, just to mention two of the wonders around the world. I mean, do you see anybody emerging in the United States who could actually take over if they were much more effective than Trump had been, you know, using the levers of power and your constitution?
Let's keep that question. I'm going to bring in Claudia Baker's question as well, because we're running out of time. So I'll bring in Claudia's as well. So Claudia, go ahead, Claudia.
Do foreign and trade policies have any bearing on this?
On what? On what?
On Republican support.
Okay. Let's go to Doug again. First of all, I think we've talked partly about populists and what politicians are out there already. Are there any populist alternatives to Trump? And then I guess foreign policy and trade policy, that was a big thing when it came to places like Ohio and Iowa. You're thinking about farmers, because many of them got very hard hit. Trade policy, that was something that was going to hit them hard too as well. Doug.
Yes, and Ohio is one of the major agricultural states, particularly here in what we call the Corn Belt, and a leader in chickens and hogs and many other agricultural products. And just within a few miles of where I am, we're in corn country. Once again, a lot of these traditional rural Republicans, they stuck with Trump. And some of my rural neighbors out here, it's been a bumpy 4 years, but we've had other things to blame it on, conditions in China, now the virus. And by and large, they stuck with the president, irrespective of in some cases, their bottom line as it relates to international trade in the agricultural sector. Will that hold 2, 4, 6 years into the future, or will they begin to suffer? As it relates to an upcoming populist strongman, I don't know. We've had strongmen in times of crisis. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, essentially the same constitution we're living with today. Been a few more.
I think of Ted Cruz, Doug. I think of Ted Cruz.
Yeah, well, and with the respect to, I think, Geraldine, who's in Texas, we don't think of him much in Ohio.
We don't think of him much in Texas either.
Hilary Williams, I think I'm just going to ask the question for you, which is a good question here, and this is for Tom to pick up on. What Trump policies can Biden build on? Were they all bad? I mean, just picking up on how he's dealt with China. I mean, you could think of various policy changes that the administration might not change that dramatically.
Yeah, so keeping with the populist theme, his tough stand with China, yes, that will continue, but somehow the tariffs have to be reduced, because that's created a hardship for the United States economy and for people on the right and the left who are populists, right? And I would think that Trump campaigned in 2016 on the need for an infrastructure bill. Never happened. There was infrastructure week some years ago. So I would expect that Biden would try to pursue that and capitalize on promises made by Trump to pass an infrastructure bill, because the United States infrastructure is crumbling. I mean, literally and figuratively, it's crumbling. We need to invest in roads and bridges and ports and things like that. So those are two that come to mind. But there are a few other things, and maybe strengthening the military, but not in terms of making it bigger, but maintaining and modernizing those parts of the military that need modernization, particularly planes and ships, right? Those are things that need to be modernized.
Hilary, if you've got any more views on what policies you think Biden could pick up on, please do write them down, and I can mention those. That's Hilary Williams. Turning to another Hilary, Hilary Matthews. Hilary, I said I'd come back to you to see if your question had been answered, and you may have another question as well. Go ahead, Hilary. Oh, you had your microphone open, so open it again.
Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you, Nick. I really don't. I think I just really like to know what Biden, I think we've had some answers to this. What is Biden going to do to get those 73 million people on his side, or at least enough on his side not to create huge problems for his administration and the government? What has he got to do? He's got to create jobs. He's got to, as you just said, maybe the infrastructure policy that creation, somehow or another, that half of the population have got to be brought into this somehow. What would you do?
Great question, Hilary. Great question. Let's just get 2 or 3 points from both of you very briefly. Just thinking now, what do you think Biden has to do to win over some of that center ground, to win back some of the blue collar workers, or win back any of the 73 million to be a more, bring both sides together to be more successful in winning over those votes? So Doug first.
Thank you. Briefly, I think he can try to govern as a mature president, as a statesman. I think and hope that, and I try to be an optimist, I think I still am, that if the 24-hour news cycle and the Twitter world is not so steeped and filled with invective and negative comments coming directly from the White House, but something opposite, I think that if he can show some success. Infrastructure is a great place that Trump didn't get it done. Biden should be able to get that done with a Republican and Democrat Senate and House. And then I think hopefully people will begin to forget the negative parts they're tired of and embrace the positive successes in the near future.
Fantastic. Tom, your thoughts?
So I absolutely agree with Doug that there needs to be maturity at the top, right? And Biden has been doing that since he was basically sort of accepted as the president-elect, and his rhetoric ever since has been, we are one America, and we all need to work together. It's soothing, it's responsible, it's mature. The infrastructure thing, I would argue that for everything that he says, and even especially when it's mature and professional, he's got to deliver something concrete. Right? He needs to do things like an infrastructure bill, and I would also argue restore our relationships with our allies, and not promote and dramatize strongmen dictators in other countries. Right? Those things will restore America's greatness in a way that Trump spoke about but never really delivered, at least in my mind. And I would say that if he can govern in a way that doesn't make the average person tremble when opening the newspaper every morning, right? Like what's going to shock me today? That will bring a kind of normalcy back to the United States that I think people will appreciate. Right? They're going to be inflamed by, if they're tuning into Fox, they're going to be inflamed by Fox. And if they're tuning into MSNBC, they're going to get inflamed there. But the vast majority don't watch either, right? They're somewhere in the middle, and they'll dabble with Fox and MSNBC. But
there are days where one fears opening the website or opening a paper thinking, what next?
Exactly.
It almost becomes too much. I think we have this the sense of shock that we've been living through, and it's not just to do with Trump and many other things. Hilary Williams, it's been our fault we haven't managed to get you your microphone up online. I just want you to come in with any thoughts or questions just before we go. Hilary, you go ahead if you can open your microphone. Did we address your question, Hilary? Go on, Hilary. It's Stuart. Yeah, Stuart, go on.
Whose voice hasn't dropped? No, she's sitting here with me. And,
right.
We went to her iPad. Yeah, I mean that. There was an article by Matthew Paris about Trump, and saying that he's by no means a Trump fan, quite the reverse. But he did say that Trump had performed the role of being the bad cop in trying to get the Europeans to pay more for their own defence and not relying on the US, and and playing bad cop with North Korea as well, and that in that respect he's sort of the opposite of Biden, who's very sort of genteel and old school type.
Okay, well, we're gonna bring in more of these comments and thoughts. I'd love more of people's comments and thoughts in the next section of the program. I'm going to say thank you very much indeed to Tom Baldino and to Doug Preisse. It's been a really interesting discussion.